Hi, everyone. Welcome to Headlines on A News. I'm Anita Sharma. Criticism of Ukraine and its president continues, with U.S. President Donald Trump calling Vladimir Zelensky a dictator without elections. And now reports indicate the U.S. will not co-sponsor a UN motion backing Ukraine. It's been a whirlwind month, with key members of the U.S. administration indicating a willingness to work directly with Russia to end the war and not giving Ukraine, or the EU for that matter, a seat at the negotiating table, at least not imminently. Joining me to discuss the latest developments is Victor Rudd from the Ukrainian American Bar Association in New York. Victor, there's so much to get through here. The news is flying, misinformation, disinformation, call it what you will. But let's start with the report that Reuters has come out with, indicating that it's spoken to a few diplomats who've stated off the record that the U.S. will not co-sponsor a draft UN resolution marking 3 years since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. A resolution essentially that supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemns Russian aggression. Your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, it's in a way, it's very, very surprising. Certainly, it is a reversal of the historic United States position. It is a loose play with facts and reality. And it is particularly disconcerting. In addition to everything that's being covered in the press, a couple of points are not being covered. And that is that, ironically, I may have made this comment in an earlier interview that I had with your program, that when Ukraine renewed its independence in 1991, that is what ensured the disintegration of the Soviet Union, as you know, and liberation finally for all of the former so-called republics, including Azerbaijan.
Right.
Well, the fall of the Soviet Union made America great again, right? America won the Cold War, so to say, and that was attributable precisely to Ukrainian independence. So you have to ask, that makes this reversal all the most extreme and seemingly inexplicable.
Yeah.
On top of that, as you know, the United States required that Ukraine surrender its nuclear arsenal. So what's the message to the world? Having nuclear arms is good policy. It's a stunning reversal. I can't say anything more than that, and it is consistent, unfortunately, with what we knew Trump was saying for many years.
Yeah, by all accounts, it seems to be a stunning reversal. Look, there was no doubt that the U.S. administration was likely going to go in the direction it is, especially as it pertains to its relationship with Europe, which we'll get to in a second with the EU. But a lot of folks, a lot of analysts are rather surprised and shocked at how quickly he just assumed office weeks ago, and how quickly this is all, from their perspective, unraveling. We're talking decades upon decades of a staunch relationship with allies, where the EU, as you know, not having a seat at the table at the negotiations in Riyadh. Of course, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, saying they will be part of the negotiations at some point, but still not being present at Riyadh. Now you have Europe essentially trying to reconvene with its allies, the allies that it has, to try to find a way to forge a way forward.
Well, that's absolutely right. And the bottom line is that the cake will be baked, the bread will be baked by Trump without Ukraine or Europe. And then Trump is going to walk out of the kitchen, and you, Europe and Ukraine, you're going to eat my bread, you're going to eat my cake the way I baked it. You have to ask yourself a very, very serious question. And starting off with what the point you made in terms of how abrupt it seems all of this is, but it is not. I firmly believe this is something that has been in the works for many years. And when you look at how the whole thing was broached, it wasn't as if Putin was calling the United States and says, look, let's see if we can work this out. Even if he was doing it because he wanted to have a break in the fighting in order to strengthen his own military position, he would have done it. He was not. It was the United States that approached Putin and broke the world isolation. Putin achieved, forgetting about any agreement, but the mere overture by the United States to Putin achieved for Putin precisely what he wanted all along, which is imagery and legitimacy on the world stage. And somebody made the analogy as like Julius Caesar approaching some wild Germanic barbaric tribe. Excuse me for using this terminology, but it's used historically sometimes. And that's precisely the point. If you look at how the Secretary of Defense speaks, Rubio and others, they're speaking from a script. You can see that, you can sense it. A reporter had asked the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, what kind of concessions is Putin making? He hasn't made a single one, and Hegseth could not reply. He was just basically frozen out of it. I have no question this has been in fermentation for quite a number of years, and I am even more now convinced of the concerns that I had going back to 2016 about the ties between Russia and Trump.
Yeah, you're a lawyer, an attorney, as we say, I guess, in the United States. You're used to making deals, cutting deals. U.S. President Donald Trump often credits himself for making stellar deals. Well, a lot of folks know that the one who's the most aggressive, the most anxious to get a deal done is usually the one that's not, let's say, in a position of power, if you will. Does this ultimately mean that Russia perhaps could continue to call the shots, if in fact that's what you're insinuating?
Well, I'm not, I guess you could say insinuation, but maybe that sort of has a malevolent connotation to it. Whatever agreement comes out of it, it will not be good, first and foremost, for the United States. Our credibility already, just with this one event, I am absolutely convinced has been essentially destroyed. American credibility globally with allies, and basically we look like fools in the eyes of Putin, China, and every other adversary that we have. And even if, let's imagine this, let's imagine that the agreement, whatever it is, isn't as bad as people fear. Let's assume that on words, it's good. Our credibility is still terrible. Why? The way this was done. The words that were used, the ignoring the allies, name calling of Zelensky, making up numbers. Look at the, and even look at this so-called mineral sharing agreement that was submitted. That's what the mafia does, for extortion, what's called shakedown purposes. $500 billion? But what is this all about?
Speaking of the minerals deal, Victor, we just heard from the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, from the White House, and he basically said Ukraine must, quote unquote, tone down its criticism of the U.S. and sign that minerals deal, what you were just talking about, that $500 billion deal.
Yes, that's correct. And it's not just, first of all, let's just talk about the whole concept of when, where, and how then the United States will support one of its strongest allies. If you can pay for it, fine. What does that mean? That means there is absolutely no understanding, none whatsoever, of the security consequences for the United States and why this is being done. And if you pay for something and then you run out of money for paying for it, then the United States turns around and goes away. It betrays the reality that Trump and the people around him simply do not know and understand what is in the interest of the United States, or they do, or they think they do, but they're doing it for another purpose, another motivation. This is nothing that the United States has ever done with any ally. And it isn't just the mineral wealth. It includes also essentially the entirety of the of Ukraine's economy, with the ports, exports, and everything else. And further, the mineral wealth, most of the mineral wealth in Ukraine is 70% or so is precisely on the territories currently occupied by Russia. I believe that this was, and this is a typical Russian way of approaching things, that this was done in a way to make sure that Ukraine rejects the deal. It is so extreme. No responsible leader of any country in the world could ever agree to this. And then when Ukraine rejects it, which it has so far, then the blame is on Ukraine, and therefore there is no agreement, and it's all Ukraine's fault. It is, to me, a setup.
What can and should Ukraine do now? We know that while those talks were happening in Riyadh with Rubio and his counterpart, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who I want to talk about a bit more in a second, but we know that Zelensky was in Turkey. Speaking with President Erdogan there, drumming up support and getting that support. What more does Zelensky have to do in the face of this new turn of events?
Well, first of all, your readers, as I think they may, if only because of the Azerbaijani community in Ukraine and the feedback that Azerbaijan is getting through those avenues. But your readers or your viewers and others have to understand how horrific the situation is in Ukraine, not only for the military, but for the civilians, the children, and everything else. So the position of Ukraine through Zelensky or whoever is in his shoes, it is not just to go and to give pronouncements of support, which Ukraine has been getting since 2014. In this case, from Turkey, it's very, very critical. And we understand that Turkey has its own, as every other nation has its own interest in ensuring that its borders are secure. And of course, the historic tie that Turkey has with Crimea. We had this expressions of support, of course, by Europeans and the conference in Paris and everything else. The British Prime Minister has talked about troops. The reality is, as it always is, you have to have capacity, you have to have force, you need equipment, you need weapons, you need medicine, you need guns, you need ammunition. And Europe right now is in a very, very poor position to do that. Europe stripped itself of any credible military capacity after the Soviet Union fell apart. And yet, Europe and the United States have fallen victim to the typical Russian tactic of accuse, threaten, and demand, in this case, that NATO is a threat to the Soviet Union, or in this case, to Russia. NATO has been stripped of any effectiveness, as far as I'm concerned, to be a threat to Russia. It still has the capacity to help defend Ukraine, protect its skies in particular, protect its civilians. It's not a threat to Russia.
And with NATO, you need the U.S. support, right? I mean, you listen to various members of the EU essentially say, we're here, we're supporting Ukraine, but they still, at the end of the day, need the U.S. to pick up the baton and lead the way, which by all accounts is not happening, at least not at this stage, especially when you have words coming out claiming someone's a dictator, someone needs to tone down their criticism of the United States. To your point, I talked about Sergei Lavrov a bit earlier. I interviewed a Russian ambassador earlier this week, and he said they're really envisioning a time now where it'll be the U.S. alongside Russia that essentially takes the reins and works together in terms of having success, if you will, especially in the northern part of the hemisphere. What are your thoughts on that? I only asked you that question given the fact that you said you're not surprised that talks have gone this way so quickly into Trump entering the second term.
Yes, I think a deal has been struck, or at least Trump thinks that a deal has been struck. And for Russia, I think they're playing on a very simplistic, superficial belief, expectation, or a hope on the part of the United States that somehow let's make up, let's harvest, and let's be friends, and we can confront China. That is never going to happen. There is no way that Russia will be used unwittingly by the United States somehow. The United States is a child when it comes to being an actor on the world stage.
Oh,
It's a
wow.
child with a big, big stick. But in terms of its sophistication, knowledge of world affairs, history, cultures, languages, everything, faith, everything that moves nations, that defines nations and propels them for good or for bad, the United States does not comprehend. It has not had that experience. And of all people, of all administrations, this one is the absolute worst one. Europe has to learn that it cannot rely on the United States. It has two nuclear members that has to be built up for defense purposes, and Europe has to rearm on an explosive pace. And the unfortunate story is they're going to have to spell this out to its population.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a clue. You can't sit around drinking espressos and eating croissants and thinking that is the way the world functions. It does not.
It is going to be tough, right, for Europe. You have key countries that are facing elections, and in many countries, an electorate, by and large, that doesn't want to see any further support of the war. So it's going to be a tough sell for these various countries within the EU to, just putting it bluntly, selling it to the electorate.
It will be tremendously. Democracies, as you know, I'm not going to say anything new. On the one hand, it is a wonderful form of government. The problem is, if you have an uninformed electorate, it is the worst form of government. And a lot of people do not want to be informed because then they have to deal with the reality. And the only people who know and have been informed, not through words and not through news programs, are people who have suffered on their own skins, or their children or their families. And in terms of Russia, that is on the east, of course, Eastern Europe and the Baltics, Finland, the Caucasus regions, including your nation, the territory between the Black and and the Caspian Sea, and elsewhere in what we call Central Asia. Without that experience, I don't think you can know and understand. Hopefully, maybe Poland, the Baltic countries, as they have been doing, can talk a little bit more sense to the Europeans. I'm surprised that Denmark, even before Trump came up with the idea of making Greenland a suburb of Washington, D.C., Denmark, of all countries, has been very, very supportive of Ukraine. And I sometimes scratch my head a little bit because their peaceful existence and a fruitful and well-off citizenry electorate is like any place else in Western Europe. And yet the politicians there seem to understand. I don't know why, but it's good.
Getting back to Lavrov, we also know that he's confirmed Moscow is indeed in talks to create a quote-unquote Eurasian Union, all countries on the Eurasian continent. And it seems like they're already starting to work on this after President Putin mentioned it. It looks like they're signing new agreements and they want to forge a new way forward. So Russia's getting on pace with forging new relationships, creating new allies, or strengthening some ally relationships, if you will. Europe seems to have been caught blindsided, much like Ukraine, given Trump's second term in office and what's transpired in this last 4 weeks or so.
Yeah, well, Ukraine has been caught blindsided, although not really. There was a tremendous amount of anxiety when Trump won the election, of course. So in terms of Ukraine being blindsided in that respect, no. Europe, yes, but the United States and Europe have been blindsided by Lavrov's proposal. I have not focused on it too much myself. But look, it's no surprise. Number one, Russia covers 1/3 of Asia.
Mm-hmm.
The entirety of what we can geographically decide as Asia is within Russia's borders. That tells you many, many things. Number two, people in Ukraine and other countries who follow this know very well and have read from cover to cover the book, The Foundation of Geopolitics, by Alexander Dugin, published in 1997, together with the co-authorship of a member of the Russian General Staff. What does it talk about? It talks about precisely what Lavrov now is discussing. And it talked for the separation of England from Europe, separation of the United States from Europe, the disintegration of NATO, the creation of a joint Russian-Islamic alliance against the United States, with, very specifically, as the foremost ally being Iran, and the push into Eurasia. This is a blueprint of many that is being implemented. It's on a long-term scale, which is the way Russia always works. Most people and Americans, we think in terms of maybe a week in advance, maybe 2 weeks in advance, not a generation or two.
It's exciting times for sure. We talk about which way Russia's intending to go. We already know the U.S.'s stance at this juncture, the U.S. administration's stance, if you will. Now it's really going to be interesting to see how Ukraine steps up, how the EU steps up and finds its way forward. I'd be remiss, actually, if I didn't talk about China. Where does China figure in all of this? If relationships are being redrawn, if the allied map, if you will, is being redrawn, where does China factor in here?
The short answer is I don't know, but it factors in from the side, so to speak. If people on Trump's staff, as most of the United States, has been apoplectic about China for so long, the first question they should ask themselves is, if you thought you were doing the right thing now, if you think what you're doing is good, why did you do what you did with China in 1979 when you extended diplomatic recognition? Why did you put China on its feet? And all of a sudden, you realize, well, you don't realize that was a huge mistake. China now is everything that is seemingly driving the United States. Look what a colossal geopolitical disaster the United States brought upon its head. It's doing that again now with Ukraine. I don't know what to expect further with China. Of course, they have ambitions globally. They are a power. We put it on its feet. We gave them the stainless steel technology for a better frying pan that they used to manufacture ball bearings for atomic weaponry now. So it's no joke. But they are obtaining, I think, a tremendous amount of satisfaction about American global incompetence. I don't think that they are at all concerned about Trump talking about the need to focus on China, because that demonstration is not a demonstration of comprehension, understanding. I don't think that Trump and the administration right now really have any ability or understanding of what they have to do with China. And frankly, I don't think we're going to do anything if China does, in fact, invade Taiwan. I do not believe it will happen. We may aid militarily. There will be no American troops in Taiwan, and that is the tripwire.
All right. Well, a lot to process there, a lot to digest. Excellent information all the way around. A great pleasure, Victor Rudd, speaking with you. I appreciate you making time for us here at A News. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Good night. Take care.
Good night. I'm Anita Sharma for Headlines on A News. Have a good day.